Marcus Whitaker had spent years designing and building his home from the ground up. It wasn't just another piece of real estate, it was a personal achievement, the culmination of decades of experience in structural engineering, long nights spent refining blueprints, and an obsessive dedication to detail. Every beam, every tile, every inch of the property was crafted with precision, designed not just to be aesthetically perfect, but functionally resilient. It was his masterpiece, a testament to the kind of discipline that had shaped his entire career. He had never intended to sell it until now. The decision to move hadn't come lightly. Marcus wasn't the type to uproot his life on a whim, but circumstances had shifted. The idea of living by the ocean, waking up to the sound of waves instead of the distant hum of the neighborhood, had become more appealing as time went on. He had no financial struggles, no sudden obligations forcing him to relocate, but he had reached a point where he wanted something different. A quieter existence. A place where he didn't have to think about property lines, homeowners association rules, or bureaucratic nonsense. He had worked hard, built a legacy, and now it was time to move on. Selling the house had seemed straightforward at first. The market was strong, demand for properties in his neighborhood was high, and his home, with its modern yet timeless design, was among the most desirable in the area. His real estate agent had been confident that they would secure an excellent deal well above the appraised value. The first potential buyer, a corporate executive relocating from another state, had been eager to close. Everything had been moving smoothly until, seemingly out of nowhere, the deal fell apart. It started with a phone call from the buyer's mortgage lender. There had been a reassessment of the home's value, and the numbers had come back lower than expected, significantly lower. The bank had suddenly revised their estimate, slashing the property's valuation by $10,000. When Marcus had asked why, they had been vague, citing market fluctuations and issues within the neighborhood. It was an excuse that made no sense. The surrounding properties had been selling at record highs. His home had no structural defects, no hidden problems. There was no logical reason for the sudden devaluation. At first he had assumed it was some kind of clerical error. Perhaps the bank had pulled old records, mistaken his home for another, or simply miscalculated. His agent had assured him they would sort it out. But then the pattern emerged. Another interested buyer backed out at the last minute, citing concerns about the area's stability. When Marcus pressed for details, they hesitated, reluctant to say too much, only offering vague statements about rumors they had heard. It wasn't just his home. Other properties in the neighborhood were experiencing the same issue, appraisals coming back suspiciously low, buyers suddenly losing interest, homeowners finding themselves trapped, unable to sell without accepting devastating losses. Something was wrong. The first real sign of manipulation came in the form of an official notice from the Homeowners Association, an unexpected and entirely fabricated violation. According to the letter, his house was in non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards. The absurdity of the claim nearly made him laugh. His home had been featured in architectural magazines, praised for its design. Every modification he had ever made had been approved. Now, out of nowhere, he was being told his property no longer fit the accepted visual harmony of the community. It was a blatant lie, and more importantly, it was the kind of lie that carried financial consequences. A violation like this, if left unchallenged, could be used to justify further devaluation. It could be cited in future appraisals, leveraged by potential buyers as an excuse to lowball offers. Marcus wasn't naive, he understood how these games were played. But what unsettled him wasn't just the violation itself, it was why it was happening. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted his home's value to drop. Someone was making sure that selling his house wouldn't be easy. His suspicions deepened when he started looking into recent sales in the neighborhood. A disturbing trend emerged: homes that had been undervalued and then scooped up by a single entity, Trinity Investments. The company had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the community, always under similar circumstances. A seller would be forced to accept a low offer, and within weeks, ownership would transfer to Trinity. It wasn't a normal real estate investment firm. There was no public face, no advertising, no attempts to flip the properties for profit. The homes just sat there, unoccupied, as if waiting for something. Marcus had built his career on solving problems, approaching every issue with logic and precision. He didn't believe in coincidences, and this situation had too many irregularities to ignore. The Homeowners Association was actively sabotaging property values. Trinity Investments was taking advantage of the resulting distressed sales. But why? And more importantly, who was really behind it? It was then that he remembered something his real estate agent had mentioned in passing Karen Lawson. Karen was the head of the association, the self-appointed enforcer of community standards. She had always been difficult, wielding her position with an authority that far exceeded what was reasonable. She thrived on control, dictating everything from the color of mailbox posts to the acceptable length of a front lawn. She had fought him on modifications to his home before, always under the guise of maintaining the neighborhood's integrity. But this was something more. This wasn't just her usual brand of pettiness, this was calculated. Marcus didn't know what Karen's exact role was yet, but he was willing to bet that she was connected to Trinity Investments. Either she was orchestrating the property devaluations herself, or she was working with someone who was. The violations, the sudden shift in appraisal values, the targeted acquisitions, it was too deliberate to be anything else. If he didn't act now, he would have no choice but to sell at a loss. He wouldn't let that happen. He had spent years designing his home, pouring his expertise and resources into it. He wasn't about to let someone like Karen, or whoever she was working with, steal that from him. But if they had gone this far to manipulate the market, to sabotage homeowners and force them into desperation, then they weren't going to stop just because he knew what was happening. If anything, they were about to push harder. And Marcus was ready for them. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to remain rational under pressure. He was the type of man who faced problems head-on, dissected them with methodical precision, and devised solutions without letting emotion cloud his judgment. But as he stared at the official notice in his hand, a flicker of something unfamiliar settled in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to anger. The Homeowners Association had always been a bureaucratic nuisance, issuing petty fines and arbitrary restrictions that served no purpose other than to justify its own existence. But this was different. The letter claimed that his home was now in violation of new aesthetic guidelines that had supposedly been implemented to maintain the neighborhood's harmonious character. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the implication was clear. His house, the very structure he had meticulously designed and built, was no longer considered acceptable. It was absurd. Nothing about his home had changed. There had been no complaints, no previous warnings, no legitimate reason for this sudden citation. And yet, here it was, stamped with the signature of Karen Lawson, the woman who had turned micromanagement into an art form. He had never paid much attention to her before. She was one of those people who thrived on authority, someone who derived a sick satisfaction from exercising control over others, no matter how small or insignificant the power she wielded. She had made herself the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of the community, enforcing rules that benefited no one but herself. But now, it seemed, she had escalated beyond her usual brand of petty authoritarianism. Marcus wasn't the kind of person to make accusations without proof. He dealt in facts, in tangible evidence, in things that could be quantified and analyzed. So before he did anything rash, he decided to do exactly what he did best: gather information. The first step was to look into the supposed policy change that had rendered his house non-compliant. According to the letter, the new guidelines had been implemented 6 months ago and had been approved by a majority vote from the association's board members. That was the first red flag. If such a significant policy shift had taken place, he would have received formal notification. There would have been discussions, meetings, announcements. Instead, this was the first he had heard of it. He pulled up the association's website, scouring through their meeting minutes and policy updates. Nothing. No mention of new aesthetic regulations, no record of a vote, nothing that even hinted at the existence of the rule they were now using against him. It was as if the policy had materialized out of thin air. That's when he noticed something else: dozens of other violations, all issued within the past 2 months. It wasn't just him. Other homeowners had been targeted as well, At first glance, the complaints seemed unrelated. Some were for landscaping inconsistencies, others for improper maintenance of exterior fixtures. But when Marcus looked at the list of addresses, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every single one of these properties had been on the market recently. The connection was undeniable. Anyone trying to sell their home was suddenly facing legal and financial roadblocks that made it impossible to close a deal. And just like his situation, the complaints were vague, difficult to refute, and seemingly designed to stall the sales process. That's when Marcus started checking property records. It was a tedious process, but he had experience navigating bureaucratic databases, and after a few hours he found what he was looking for: the sales histories of homes that had been flagged. More than half had been sold at a loss within the past year, and in nearly every case the buyer had been Trinity Investments. It wasn't just his gut instinct anymore. This was an operation. A systematic effort to drive down property values, create artificial financial strain, and force homeowners into desperation. The question was why. Marcus wasn't naive. Real estate manipulation was nothing new. He had seen corporations manufacture housing crises before, usually by exploiting market loopholes, economic downturns, or legislative blind spots. But this was something else. This was a deliberate, coordinated effort using the association as a weapon. And it was working. He needed to find out who was really behind Trinity Investments. The name itself was suspicious: a shell corporation, registered under an anonymous holding group. There were no listed board members, no public affiliations, no website. Just a network of subsidiaries designed to obscure ownership. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to stay hidden. Marcus took a step back, considering his next move. He had enough evidence to confirm his suspicions, but not enough to act on them. If he confronted Karen now, she would just deny everything, gaslight him, make him look paranoid. If he went straight to the authorities, he would need a hell of a lot more than a hunch and a suspicious paper trail. No, he needed to be smart about this. He needed leverage. The first thing he did was reach out to other homeowners who had received violations. Many were reluctant to talk, fearful, exhausted, resigned to their fate. But one couple, David and Laura Briggs, were willing to meet. They had tried to fight their citation and had quickly learned that resistance only made things worse. Their story mirrored his own. First, they had received an unexpected violation notice while in the process of selling their home. When they tried to dispute it, more violations appeared. Then, suddenly, their buyers started pulling out at the last minute, citing mysterious financial concerns. Then came the anonymous offers. They had been approached by a private investor offering to buy their house outright for 30% below market value. When they refused, they were suddenly hit with unexplained fees, fines, and legal threats. Eventually, they had no choice but to sell. Trinity Investments had bought their home. As they spoke, Marcus could see the exhaustion in their faces, the frustration of people who had been crushed under a system designed to exploit them. David leaned in, lowering his voice. We tried to look into them. Hired a lawyer. He disappeared after 2 weeks, stopped answering our calls, told us to drop it. That was enough for Marcus. This wasn't just corruption, it was intimidation. And the worst part? It was working. He left that meeting with a growing sense of urgency. If this was the pattern, then he knew exactly what was coming next. They were going to escalate. It was no longer just about selling his home. It was about stopping whatever the hell was happening before it swallowed the entire neighborhood. And if Trinity Investments, Karen Lawson, and whoever was really pulling the strings thought they could strong-arm him the way they had everyone else, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Marcus had always believed that logic and preparation could solve any problem, that as long as you had the right data, the right expertise, and a rational approach, there was always a way forward. But as the days passed and he watched the quiet, calculated pressure mounting against him, he realized that this was not a battle that could be won through reason alone. Whoever was orchestrating this knew exactly how to make their targets feel isolated, how to push just hard enough to make people doubt their own instincts, how to apply the right kind of stress to make a person crack before they even understood what was happening to them. It started subtly, just like with the Briggs family and all the others who had tried to sell their homes. The first sign that things were escalating was when his listing disappeared from the MLS database. He had been checking it daily, making sure that the promotional materials were still visible, watching for new inquiries. And then, one morning, it was simply gone. No notification, no warning. When he called his real estate agent, the woman sounded confused but not surprised, like she had seen this happen before but didn't want to admit it. "There's been a request to put a hold on the listing," she said hesitantly, as if she was choosing her words carefully. "Apparently there's an issue with the property status. Something about pending violations and a possible rezoning review." That last part made Marcus's stomach tighten. Rezoning? That wasn't just a bureaucratic headache, it could completely destroy his home's marketability. A property that was suddenly under zoning review could be flagged as unstable or unfit for residential sale, which would scare away buyers and further tank the value. He tried to remain calm, but his real estate agent was already bracing for him to drop the listing. She wasn't pushing back, wasn't offering solutions. He could hear the caution in her voice, the careful distance she was putting between herself and the situation, as if she had already decided it was too risky to get involved. "Who requested the hold?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral. "I don't know," she admitted, but she knew more than she was saying. "These things just happen sometimes." That was a lie. He could tell from the slight hesitation in her voice, the careful vagueness of her answer. But there was no point in pushing her. She was already folding, already stepping back, the way people do when they sense they're up against something bigger than themselves. Fine, he would handle it himself. He went straight to the zoning office, expecting the usual slow-moving bureaucracy, but what he found was far more organized than it should have been. His file had already been flagged, marked for review by an unnamed official. There was no clear reasoning, just a generic placeholder note about potential inconsistencies in property classification. It was a stalling tactic, nothing more, but it was an effective one. He requested an official review of the complaint, only to be told that it could take up to 6 months to resolve. If he needed to contest it, he would have to hire an attorney, file a formal appeal, and submit extensive documentation proving that his home's zoning had not, in fact, changed. He had no doubt that if he did all of that, they would find another excuse to delay. This was how they did it. They didn't need to take anything from you outright. They just had to make the process so frustrating, so expensive, so painfully slow that you either gave up or ran out of money trying to fight it. When he got home that evening, he found a yellow notice taped to his front door. It was another violation. This time it claimed that his driveway was out of compliance due to improper drainage. That was nonsense. He had designed the damn thing himself, and the permits were all on file. But logic didn't matter here. The moment he stepped inside, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another real estate scam, but something in his gut told him to pick up. A low, measured voice greeted him. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, polite but impersonal, like he was reading from a script. "I understand you've been having some issues with your property sale." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this? Someone who can help?" There was a slight pause, a calculated hesitation. "You're in a difficult position. But you don't have to be." Marcus sat down, keeping his voice steady. "I'm listening." "We represent an interested buyer," the man continued smoothly. "Someone who is willing to make you a cash offer. No inspections, no paperwork. A clean sale. We can close in a matter of days." Marcus let out a slow breath. There it was. "And what's the offer?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The man named a number. It was less than half of what the house was worth. Marcus laughed. "You think I'm that desperate? You'd be surprised how many people are," the man replied, still calm, still perfectly composed. "Look, I get it. You're a smart guy. You want to fight this. But ask yourself, is it worth it? How much time do you really want to spend on legal fees and zoning battles and endless delays? How much stress do you want to put yourself through?" Marcus didn't answer. "Take the deal," the man said, "because I guarantee you it's the best one you're going to get." Then he hung up. For a long time, Marcus just sat there, staring at the phone, This wasn't just some faceless real estate firm preying on struggling homeowners. This was a full-scale operation, a machine. They knew exactly when to apply pressure, exactly when to make you feel like you were drowning. They waited until you were exhausted, frustrated, until you were ready to take anything just to make the nightmare stop. But what they hadn't counted on was Marcus not breaking. By the time he went to bed that night, he had already made a decision. He wasn't going to cave, wasn't going to take their insulting offer just because they had stacked the deck against him. If they wanted to play dirty, then fine, he would play smarter. But the next morning they pushed again. His water had been shut off. The utility company had no record of an outage, no service disruptions, no explanation. His security cameras had also gone offline overnight. And when he checked his car, he found a long, deep scratch running along the driver's side like someone had deliberately keyed it. None of it was blatant enough to report. None of it could be proven. But Marcus understood the message loud and clear. They weren't just trying to force him out. They were trying to break him. And if they thought that would work, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Marcus had expected them to retaliate. That much had been obvious from the moment he refused the insulting offer over the phone. The silence that followed had been unnerving, but he had known it wouldn't last. These people didn't just give up when they met resistance. They escalated, they adapted, they applied pressure in ways that weren't always obvious until it was too late. The next morning he walked outside to find a notice posted on his front gate. Another violation. This one claimed that his roofing materials were substandard and in need of immediate replacement. The fine attached was significant, but what caught his attention was the footnote at the bottom, a requirement to obtain an inspection from an approved contractor before the sale of his home could proceed. They were trying to box him in. If they could control who inspected his property, they could manufacture any report they wanted. He had no doubt that if he let one of their people inside, he'd be hit with a list of fabricated structural concerns, long enough to permanently freeze any potential sale. Marcus took the notice inside, tossing it onto the growing pile of paperwork on his dining table. He knew they were hoping to wear him down, to make him believe that every step forward would only be met with 2 steps back. They were banking on exhaustion, the same way they had with every other homeowner who had stood in their way. But Marcus had spent a lifetime in construction and engineering. He had built bridges that could withstand hurricanes, designed foundations meant to last a century, worked on projects where even a minor miscalculation could mean disaster. He wasn't intimidated by paperwork or regulations, and he certainly wasn't going to let a group of bureaucratic parasites dictate what he could do with his own home. Still, he needed a way to push back. He started by researching the approved contractors listed in the notice. As expected, every single one of them had direct ties to Karen Lawson and Trinity Investments. Their business addresses were listed under shell companies, their corporate filings barely a year old. A few had even been involved in lawsuits for fraudulent home inspections, falsifying damage assessments, coordinating with real estate firms to devalue properties before swooping in to buy them cheap. This wasn't just a loosely connected group of opportunists. It was an organized system, one that had been running for years. Marcus needed help. He wasn't the type to involve others in his problems, but this was bigger than him now. He called David Briggs, the man who had nearly lost everything before being forced to sell. When the call connected, there was a long silence before David spoke. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already fought this battle and lost. Marcus explained everything: the zoning hold, the mysteriously vanishing property listing, the fake violations, the utilities being shut off, the attempt to force him into an inspection that would surely render his home unsellable. He expected David to sound surprised, maybe even outraged, but when the other man finally responded, there was no shock in his voice, just grim acceptance. "This is what they do," David said. "They don't hit you all at once. They chip away at you, one piece at a time, until you wake up one day and realize you've lost." Marcus leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. "How far did they push you?" David sighed. "Far enough. When I tried to fight the violations, I suddenly had the county building inspector at my door. They told me my foundation was shifting, that I had an unresolved compliance issue from 10 years ago. It was bullshit, but it would have taken months to prove. I didn't have the time, and I sure as hell didn't have the money. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, anger burning low in his chest. This wasn't just real estate fraud. It was deliberate, calculated economic warfare. David hesitated. I still have some of the paperwork. Records, letters, even some emails from when I tried to go after them legally. It won't be enough to stop them, but maybe it'll help you understand what you're really up against. Marcus didn't waste time. Within the hour he was at David's house, sifting through a box of old documents. Most of it was what he expected: copies of fines, notices, correspondence with county offices that led nowhere. But one thing stood out: a list of property transactions linked to Trinity Investments. It showed exactly who had sold, when, and for how much. In almost every case, the price was far below market value, and buried at the bottom was a company name he hadn't seen before: Crown Point Development. Who the hell is Crown Point? Marcus muttered. David shook his head. No idea. But I know this: every single home Trinity bought ended up getting transferred to them within 6 months. A third layer to the operation. Marcus had assumed that Trinity was the end game, that they were the ones profiting off the acquisitions. But if they were just a middleman, that meant the true owners were even further removed, hidden behind yet another layer of corporate anonymity. They weren't just buying homes. They were stockpiling them. For what? The next day, Marcus made another trip to the county records office. He had spent enough time in city planning departments over the years to know that if Crown Point was involved in development, they would have permits. Sure enough, after digging through public records, he found a pending rezoning application filed by Crown Point Development. It covered nearly 20 properties in his neighborhood. His home was one of them. It was all clicking into place. The violations, the forced sales, the sudden drop in property values — they weren't just trying to buy homes. They were trying to clear the entire neighborhood. But the most alarming part wasn't what he found in the documents. It was what happened after. As he was leaving the records office, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't anything special, just an ordinary vehicle, unmarked, nothing outwardly suspicious. But as he walked to his car, he saw the driver watching him. Not casually, intentionally. Marcus kept his expression neutral, unlocking his car and getting in without hesitation. But as he pulled away, he checked his mirrors. The SUV followed. It wasn't blatant. No aggressive tailing, no reckless turns. Just a steady presence, lingering half a block behind him no matter where he went. By the time he reached his house, the SUV had disappeared. But the message had been clear. They knew he was looking. And they weren't happy about it. Marcus sat in his car for a long moment before finally stepping inside, locking the door behind him. He had confirmation now this wasn't just corruption. It was organized, well-funded, and protected by layers of legal and corporate shielding. If they were watching him, then that meant he had found something they didn't want him to know. That meant he was finally hitting a nerve. And if they were willing to go this far just to keep him from selling his home, then there was no telling what they would do next. One thing was certain: they weren't going to stop, and neither was he. Marcus had dealt with high-pressure situations before. He had worked on multi-million-dollar construction projects where a single miscalculation could mean financial ruin, had navigated bureaucratic mazes that would make most people give up before they even got started. He was no stranger to difficult negotiations, to power plays, to the underhanded tactics used by those who operated in the gray areas of legality. But this was different. This wasn't about contracts or permits. This was about control. The SUV following him from the records office had been a warning, a message sent without words: we see you. We know what you're doing. Stop. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to back down just because someone tried to intimidate him. If anything, it had the opposite effect. It confirmed that he was getting close to something they didn't want him to know. And then, the real pressure started. The following morning, his bank accounts were flagged for review. At first, he thought it was a glitch. He had logged into his account as usual, intending to transfer funds for legal fees, only to find a pending restriction notice. A fraud alert, supposedly triggered by suspicious activity. His debit card was locked. Wire transfers were temporarily disabled. He called the bank, expecting the usual hold music and scripted responses from some outsourced customer service rep, but what he got instead was a direct call from the bank's fraud department. A man with a clipped, professional tone explained that Marcus's accounts had been flagged due to irregular financial activity. "What kind of activity?" Marcus asked, gripping the phone. "We received an external request to place a compliance hold on your funds," the man said, his voice careful, detached. "It's a precautionary measure." Marcus exhaled slowly. "A request from who?" "I can't disclose that, of course." "How long will the hold last?" "We'll need to complete a full compliance review. That can take anywhere from a few days to several weeks." Weeks. They wanted to freeze his money for weeks. Marcus didn't bother arguing. He had enough liquidity spread across different accounts to keep himself afloat for a while, but that wasn't the point. They were tightening the noose, cutting off his resources, limiting his ability to act, trying to grind him down until he had no choice but to fold. He hung up without another word, already mentally rearranging his plans. They wanted to slow him down? Fine. He would work around them. By the time he stepped outside, there was a tow truck parked in front of his driveway. Two men in work uniforms stood near his car, speaking in hushed tones. One held a clipboard. The other inspected the vehicle like they were looking for damage. Marcus approached, his patience already thin. "Something I can help you with." The man with the clipboard looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Whitaker." "That's me. We've got an order to impound this vehicle." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "From who?" The man flipped through his paperwork. "Says here it's a lien enforcement." "That's impossible." The man shrugged. "Paperwork's all here. If you have an issue, you can take it up with the county office." Marcus knew exactly what this was. A fabricated claim, a fake lien thrown into the system just to inconvenience him. A bureaucratic trap designed to make him waste hours, maybe even days, untangling the mess before he could get his car back. But this time they had miscalculated. His car wasn't financed. It had been paid off in full years ago. There was no legitimate reason for a lien to exist. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through his documents. He had every title, every proof of ownership, every receipt. He didn't even bother arguing with the tow truck driver. He simply handed him the digital file. The man frowned, flipping through the pages. "This doesn't match the claim we have on file." "That's because your claim is bullshit." A long silence. The man sighed. "We're just doing our job." "Then go do it somewhere else." Another beat of hesitation. Then the tow truck pulled away. That wasn't the end of it. By the afternoon, Marcus received 3 new violations. One claimed that his front lawn was exceeding acceptable height restrictions. Another accused him of unauthorized waste disposal because his trash bins had supposedly been placed out on the wrong collection day. The third was a direct order to cease all unauthorized renovations. Renovations he hadn't even started. It was an all-out assault now. They weren't just trying to devalue his home. They were actively making his life unlivable. And then, the power went out. Not just his house, his entire side of the street. When he stepped outside, he saw a crew of utility workers at the corner, digging near a transformer box. "What's going on?" Marcus called out. One of the men turned, glancing at him briefly before answering. "Scheduled maintenance." "For what?" The man shrugged. "Routine work." Marcus watched them for a moment, weighing his options. They weren't official city workers, he could tell by the unmarked truck, the lack of proper ID badges. They had been sent specifically to cut power to his street. But confronting them wouldn't accomplish anything. He knew that by now. They thrived on plausible deniability. So instead, he made another call. Not to the city. Not to the police, to a law firm. He had been holding off on escalating things legally, trying to gather as much information as possible before making a move. But now, they had forced his hand. By evening, he was sitting in a conference room with a litigation specialist. "I've seen cases like this before," the lawyer said, flipping through the documents Marcus had brought. "But not at this scale." Marcus leaned back. What's the move? The lawyer exhaled. You need to document everything. Every violation, every service disruption, every attempt to interfere with your sale. The goal isn't just to file a complaint, we're building a case for coordinated property fraud. And how long does that take? The lawyer met his gaze. That depends on how badly they want to win. Marcus knew exactly what that meant. If they were willing to go this far just to get him to sell, then they had deeper investments in this neighborhood than anyone realized. And if that was the case, then they weren't going to stop until one of them was completely destroyed. Marcus intended to make sure it wasn't him. Marcus had expected them to hit back harder after he brought in legal representation, but even he wasn't prepared for just how quickly they retaliated. The violations, the utilities being cut, the financial interference, those were small moves compared to what happened next. Because now, they weren't just trying to pressure him into selling. Now they wanted him gone. The first real sign came late at night. He had been working through documents, cataloging every fraudulent claim and fabricated charge, when a noise outside made him pause. Not the usual creaks of an old house settling, not the rustling of tree branches against the windows, something deliberate. A sharp metallic clang. Footsteps. Someone moving where no one should be. Marcus didn't turn on the lights. He moved carefully, staying low as he reached for the handgun he kept locked in a drawer. He had always been a cautious man, had seen enough in his line of work to know that when pressure escalates, so does desperation. He checked the cameras on his phone. 2 figures, both dressed in dark clothing, near his garage. One crouched low, doing something near his car, while the other stood watch. Marcus exhaled slowly, heart hammering. This was new. Up until now they had used legal loopholes and bureaucracy to make his life hell. But this was a direct escalation. He moved quietly, slipping toward the back entrance. He had no intention of confronting them head-on, not yet. He wanted to see what they were doing. As he crept along the side of the house, staying in the shadows, the one near his car stood up and said something low to the other. A moment later they both retreated, moving fast, disappearing down the street before Marcus could get a better look at them. They had left something behind. Marcus moved cautiously, scanning the area before approaching his car. His tires had been slashed. Not just punctured, but deeply gouged, the kind of damage that would blow out completely if he tried to drive on them. And that wasn't all. A piece of paper was tucked under his windshield wiper. Stop. Sell. Leave. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, his grip tightening on the gun at his side. They were done playing games. He took photos of the damage, documented everything. His lawyer would need this. But more than that, Marcus wanted them to know he wasn't scared. The next morning he replaced the tires. By the afternoon he had installed new motion-activated floodlights that would make sure anyone approaching his property would be visible. And by nightfall he had reached out to an independent security consultant. If they wanted to escalate, so could he. But it wasn't just his property they were attacking anymore. That evening David Briggs called him. There was an edge to his voice that Marcus hadn't heard before. They came after me, David said. I don't know how, but they found out I talked to you. Marcus's stomach dropped. What happened? The county inspectors showed up at my house this morning, David said. Said there was a complaint about hazardous materials on my property. Total bullshit. But they brought a warrant. Spent hours tearing through my garage, taking pictures, making a show of it. Marcus clenched his jaw. Did they find anything? Of course not, David snapped. Because there was nothing to find. But now I have an open violation on file, and they told me I have 2 weeks to resolve the issue before they start fining me. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. They're trying to isolate me. Yeah, David said. And it's working. There was silence on the line. Then, softer, look, man, I've got a family. I can't risk this going further. Marcus closed his eyes. He couldn't blame David. The man had already been through hell once. I get it, Marcus said finally. A heavy pause. Then, be careful, the call ended. Marcus sat in his chair for a long moment, staring at the stack of files in front of him. He had been collecting everything, preparing to file a formal complaint. But now it was clear that wasn't going to be enough. They weren't just using legal tactics anymore. They were sending people to his house. They were punishing anyone who helped him. That meant he had one move left. It was time to make sure they paid attention. The next morning, Marcus walked straight into the city's zoning office. He bypassed the clerks, went directly to the senior official in charge of property disputes, and dropped a thick folder onto his desk. "I need to file an injunction," Marcus said, his voice calm, controlled. The official glanced at the file, then at Marcus. "Sir, we don't handle. You're going to want to read it before you say that." Something in Marcus's tone made the man hesitate. He opened the file, skimming through the documents, flipping past the photos, the falsified reports, the paper trail linking Trinity Investments to Crown Point Development. The man's expression shifted. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You've got two choices," he said, keeping his voice measured. "You either process that injunction today, or I take this entire file straight to the state attorney's office." A long pause. Then, finally, the man exhaled and reached for his phone. It was a small victory, but it was a start. Marcus left the office knowing one thing: this wasn't over. If they had gone this far, they wouldn't back down just because he had filed a legal complaint. They would push harder. And that meant he had to be ready. Marcus knew that once the injunction was filed, the real fight would begin. He had forced their hand, taken the battle out of the shadows and into official legal channels. Up until now, they had controlled the game, dictating the pace, applying pressure in ways that made resistance feel impossible. But now they had lost the advantage of silence. There was a record, a formal challenge, a disruption in their carefully constructed web of legal manipulation. The response came faster than he expected. 2 days after the injunction was processed, he received a summons to appear in court. The claim was absurd: a defamation suit, filed on behalf of Trinity Investments. They accused him of slandering their business, spreading false accusations, and interfering with their right to operate. The message was clear: withdraw the injunction, or they would bury him in litigation. Marcus wasn't intimidated. He had seen this tactic before: a lawsuit designed not to win, but to exhaust and bankrupt the defendant. They didn't need to prove he was lying. They just needed to make the process so miserable, so time-consuming, that it became easier to settle than to fight. But Marcus wasn't playing their game. Instead of backing down, he doubled his efforts. He worked with his lawyer to refine his case, compiling every fabricated violation, every fraudulent complaint, every instance of financial interference. And then he made a move they didn't expect. He countersued. If they wanted to drag him into court, he would make sure they regretted it. His claim wasn't just a defense, it was an attack. He accused Trinity Investments and Crown Point Development of orchestrating a systematic scheme to devalue properties, falsify zoning complaints, and force homeowners into financial distress for corporate gain. He named Karen Lawson directly, linking her to nearly a dozen fraudulent transactions. For the first time since this had started, Marcus saw panic on the other side. Within 48 hours, Trinity's attorneys reached out to his lawyer, trying to negotiate a quiet settlement. They were willing to drop their defamation claim if he withdrew his lawsuit. It was a desperate attempt to keep things under control, to avoid the kind of scrutiny they had spent years dodging. Marcus refused. He wasn't just interested in protecting his own home anymore. He wanted everything exposed. The legal battle stretched on for weeks. Trinity's lawyers tried every delay tactic they could, filing endless motions, requesting extensions, doing everything in their power to stall. But Marcus's case was solid, and his lawyer was relentless. As evidence mounted, the pressure shifted. Then Karen Lawson disappeared. Not literally, she wasn't gone. But suddenly, she was no longer associated with the Homeowners Association. An emergency meeting was held, and she was removed from her position due to ongoing legal complications. It was an obvious move to distance themselves from her. The board wanted to sever ties, make her the scapegoat, pretend that she had acted alone. But Marcus had built his case too well. The problem wasn't just Karen. It was the entire system. Then, the real collapse began. County officials opened an independent investigation into property disputes in Marcus's neighborhood. A state regulatory agency launched a review of Trinity investments. Several homeowners, seeing Marcus's success, filed their own complaints. The pressure became too much. Trinity withdrew their lawsuit and offered Marcus a buyout. Not of his home, of his silence. A six-figure settlement, in exchange for dropping his claims and signing a non-disclosure agreement. He turned them down. They had spent months trying to crush him, believing he was just another homeowner they could grind into submission. But Marcus had never been fighting for money. He had been fighting to win. The fallout was swift. Trinity's assets were frozen pending an investigation. Crown Point Development pulled out of the rezoning project. The scheme unraveled. And Marcus? He sold his home for full market value. It was a symbolic victory, proof that their tactics had failed. He had protected his investment, but more importantly, he had broken their hold on the community. As he packed the last of his belongings, preparing to finally leave, he took one last look at the house he had built. It had been a battleground, a symbol of everything he had fought to protect. And now it was something else. It was his victory.